Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are very excited here at the Webby Awards to host our third event, diving into responsible technology in partnership with Omidyar Network. If we haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is CL Vanderveen, and I'm the managing director here at the Webby Awards. So through our partnership with the Omidyar Network, this year we've been able to do a lot of great things. We've introduced a suite of categories honoring responsible tech work. We've launched a trend report on the state of responsible technology through insights from industry leaders and our community, like folks like you. And we've had a really great opportunity to bring together some wonderful folks to discuss the realities of responsible tech and discuss new ways to work, new business models, and so much more. So today we're really grateful to be able to convene another one of these conversations, this time focusing on how we can build a more inclusive internet. So without further ado, I would love to take a moment for our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves so you can get to know them. First, I would love to introduce Thea Anderson from the Omidyar Network. We can pop her on there. Well, while we're waiting for Thea, why don't we pop over to Priscilla Adjaman? There's Priscilla. Thank you. Hi, Priscilla. Can you give folks just a little bit of download on who you are and sort of what you're working on?
Sure. Thank you, CL. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Priscilla Adjaman. I am the founder of Sadie Baddies, which is a virtual sanctuary designed for people of color and Black people to come together in community and remove the stigma that surrounds mental health. And I'm also the founder of the Soft Life podcast, where we have open and honest and vulnerable conversations about mental health, wellness, and our lived experiences. And I'm also a digital strategist and content writer.
Great. Thank you, Priscilla. So glad to have you here.
Thank you.
We've been able to have some great conversations before, and so I'm looking forward to your perspective on the topic today. And then I would love to have Angelo Carino join us. Hi, Angelo. Angelo's from Google. Can you give us just a little download on, what you're working on and who you are?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. My name's Angelo Carino. I lead product for inclusion, accessibility, and equity for Google's Devices and Services organization. So we explore the intersection of inclusive design and innovation. Some of the most impactful programs that you might have seen recently is Real Tone, which came to life with the Super Bowl Lizzo commercial last year. That's the ability for Google Pixel's camera to capture skin tones of all people beautifully and authentically. And Guided Frame and Google Lookout, which offer assistive vision for blind and low vision users, to name a few. And I'll talk about some of these things today. But prior to Google, I worked at Amazon Devices, leading some of their new product initiatives and moonshot tech investments in a variety of areas aimed at really revolutionizing people's access to fundamental needs.
It's wonderful. So, we've been able to have a couple of these events before and have some meaningful conversations around the topic of responsible technology. A little background. So, one of our first events this fall, we had a conversation with Dr. Fallon Wilson, who is the co-founder of Black Tech Futures Research Institute, and Michelle Lawrence Jawanda, who is the SVP of programs at Omidyar Networks. And so they talked about not only what a responsible future could look like, but sort of how we got here, the history of the internet, which I think was really insightful for me. I've worked my entire career in digital. I was at MTV for, over 18 years, but these conversations were really eye-opening for me because I didn't really think about a lot of these things before in the history of it. So when we were talking about the historics, the internet wasn't created for everyone. There are whole communities of people who have historically not had access to the internet. It wasn't made for them. So it felt important to us, to me, as we look to the future, that we try to inspire new thinking and change, that we have this conversation focused on building a more inclusive internet. So we convene three folks who are coming at this from different perspectives. Angelo, building products, and Priscilla creating these safe spaces, and Thea, who's fueling this change. So Thea, thank you for joining us. Could you give us just a quick intro on, who you are and what you've been working on?
Yeah, hi, I'm Thea Anderson with Omidyar Network. For those of you that are new to Omidyar Network, we're a social change venture. We were founded by Pam Omidyar and Pierre Omidyar. And Pierre Omidyar was the original founder of eBay. We make investments in grant making in 3 areas. So one is reimagining capitalism, responsible technology, and the third is actually a new area called building a culture of belonging, which is actually very cross-cuts through all the conversation for today. But I am here today representing our responsible technology, and we have a couple of different focus areas. So one is around fighting disinformation online and dangerous speech. Curbing big tech is an increasing area of focus for us, and supporting digital natives, so leaders and organizations that potentially are new, don't have funding, and how can we help them get some initial funding so that hopefully other organizations will provide them funding in the future, but then also to raise their profile. And a very new area, which I'm actually working on, is around gaming and emerging tech. So the infrastructure, the culture, and the new economy, and the geopolitics, especially around the gaming industry.
That's great. I mean, gaming is huge, huge. So that's a great area of emerging focus. So, let's get into it. Like let's start exploring sort of some of the first steps of building inclusive internet. But first, I think like the term has broad definitions and certainly broad applications. So I'd love to get everyone's take on, what does inclusivity mean to you in respect to the internet, and how does that shape the direction of your work? Angela, I would love to start with you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So to me, inclusion is when someone feels understood, seen, and empowered. And relating that to building an inclusive internet or digital products, I can take it one by one. I think understood is making products that fundamentally work for everyone across every dimension of identity. And I'll talk about dimensions of identity hopefully later. And then feeling seen is driving authentic and real representation in products. Think going beyond reducing harm to celebrating differences. And empowering is providing information or tools that empower users and communities to act freely and safely. When I think about the guiding principles that define my work or shape my work, I actually think of a model, I think it came from Boston University, that depicts equality versus inclusion versus equity and justice for different ability user groups trying to watch a show, and what a solution for each one of those things looks like. You can Google it. They're not all the same. They're actually quite different in practice. And the one that guides my work is really justice. And the way that they define justice there is addressing the underlying cause of inequitable experiences and rethinking the systems of design from start to finish so that the inequitable experience is not put in place in the beginning at all.
Yeah, I would love to toss to you for your perspective on inclusivity.
Yeah, thank you. As you mentioned at the beginning, we're the luxury of being a funder in this space. So we support individuals as well as organizations. And the way we think about who we fund and how we fund for an inclusive internet is really broken around 3 components. So who makes the rules, who has the power, and the new idea. So when we talk about rules, we invest in different organizations or individuals that are thinking around platform governance, the regulatory environment, guardrails, but also making sure that there's meaningful checks and balances. And power, which is definitely increasing a focus area of ours, is thinking about who makes the rules. So some of that could be, supporting unions or people that are actually the ones developing the internet or the ones working for different online companies. But it's also really one of the bigger pieces, which may sound a little bit strange, but it's also really making sure how are we building different narratives so that we as individuals or people don't necessarily continue to see tech as like the weather, right? It's something that happens to us, whereas actually tech is something that we can control what happens and who makes those decisions. So what we try to do is how can we support different networks or individuals that are really trying to make some of those shifts. I think increasingly, importantly, really starting some of that focus very much with a racial justice lens. I would say racial justice and a gender lens, but I think we have to start with the racial justice lens first. And then from the ideas, which is sometimes the fun part, the narrative building, the storytelling, is really what needs to come next for the internet to be inclusive. So what is that vision, and what does it actually need to look like with the hardware and the software, not just today, but in 20 or 30 or 50 years. And with that, we could, get to support and work with a lot of different futurists in this space.
That's great. And Priscilla, I would love to get your POV on inclusivity as well.
Sure. So inclusion and inclusivity to me as a founder and as a community builder is at the forefront of everything that I do and share with Sadi Badi specifically. So I know that for a lot of folks who are seeking online community or spaces, it's because for a long time or a period of their life, they have not felt like they were seen, or they have not had those spaces and the support to really share and connect with other individuals who might be going through similar experiences as them. And whether that's due to stigma, where they are not able to use their voice, or it's due to systemic exclusion, where they're not able to use their voice, or even loneliness. Those are some elements that have informed the types of conversations that we hold on Sadi Baddies. And inclusion to me is making sure that everyone feels seen and everyone feels safe and comfortable having conversations both online and offline.
That's great. So I think, so what your community was responding to, right, is trying to create these more human-centric experiences, inclusive spaces online that welcome and center around those who have been excluded or marginalized. So when you founded Sadi Baddies, can you share a little bit about why you did found Sadi Baddies, and how did you approach building that community?
Yes, definitely. I always say that I kind of started Sadi Baddies and built this brand backwards. I didn't really think of it at first as something that was going to connect so many thousands of people. I really was sharing it from a point of view, my perspective, where I didn't have a space where I felt heard and seen, and I didn't have a space where I could feel non-judgmental and talk about my open experiences with mental health and my wellness journey. So especially in, with my identity being a Black woman, but also being first generation American, there were not spaces built or designed for me or people that look like me or have similar identities as me to talk about mental health and talk about some of the really challenging experiences that we have. So I created it as an opportunity to start, one, removing the stigma, but two, also create a space, even though it is digital, create a digital space that can start those conversations and then move those conversations offline as well. So having in-person events like we've had, with brand partners such as Nike, or, having online events such as the conversations and workshops we've had with Rare Beauty and Pinterest. These are the types of experiences and spaces that we've created online and offline to help support people in their journey to feeling connected and feeling seen, and having the support they need to, have their well-being experienced in the best way possible, both online and offline.
So I think we're all here. We're here because we're aligned around a goal to move away from these exclusive experiences and products online, and toward a more inclusive experience. And part of that is also addressing the accessibility of products and experiences on the internet. So Angelo and Thea, I would definitely love your perspective on this, around accessibility. As I think it should be a part of a more holistic approach to inclusivity. Do you consider accessibility to be a part of your approach? And how do you approach accessibility? Angelo, would you love to take this one to start?
Sure, yeah. So I think you said it correctly that accessibility is one part or dimension of inclusion. And at Google, we like to have identified a model to think through over 10 dimensions of identity that are a part of inclusion, and accessibility is one, race and ethnicity and gender and so on are others. But the idea is to take your kind of product user journeys. A user journey is the ability to take a photo or send an email or something like that, and run that experience through with each one of these groups to gauge whether or not the product works for that user group and works for everyone. You could think about like there's an unmet, it's concentric circles, right? Like an unmet need is at the smallest core, and then an accessible design is a UX framework that embeds in the ability for the experience to work accessibly to all ability needs. And then inclusive design goes one layer out from that, is the ability from a UX perspective and design perspective for the product to work for a variety of identities and needs like race, ethnicity, and gender as well. And then on top of that is just what we call product inclusion, is the methodology and frameworks and thought processes to build for everyone. So I think these are all subsets of one another. Accessibility is a really important dimension. I would say to do accessibility well, the community talks about nothing about us without us. That's a principle from accessibility, and that it essentially means to build alongside and with a broad and diverse community of testers that represent the user groups you want to build for, because it's really hard to realize your potential product failures or biases if you're not part of that community. An example is like UI for phones were historically like very right-handed, something very simple, but made for right-handed people because the majority of people building them were right-handed. And it's like just simple switch to move iconography to the left hand of the phone, so it's easier to access when you're holding it with one hand. And then centering marginalized voices throughout every phase of product creation is very important as well, because when you build nuanced experiences that solve really technically challenging problems, you actually benefit everybody. And we call that the curb cut effect. So that's something like building closed captioning technology was originally for deaf and hard of hearing users, but a lot of people like closed captioning technology because there are plenty of times when the situations around you are very loud and you want to leverage that. So when you talk about ability or disabilities, there's 1 billion people in the world that identify as, so 1 in 7 that self-identify as having an accessibility need. Then there's a group of people that have accessibility needs that have not been identified. There are allies that live with people that have accessibility needs, like the parents of a blind child or a low vision child that then need to have accessibility solutions in their life. And then everybody at some point in their life experiences a temporary disability. That's, you could break your arm, you can get glaucoma over the age of 45, your eyes start to deteriorate. So when we talk about designing for accessibility, I really believe that it is designing for everybody at some point in their lives. And I would just say one last thing on this is we brought up like legal compliance. There are legal and compliant and regulatory bodies that look over like what accessibility design looks like. It's really built around like bare minimum requirements for basic needs for those user individuals. I like to think about like driving user delight and accessible or disabled user innovation. Because the internet and cell phones and devices are not made for basic needs. They are also made for leisure and fun and enjoyment. And we very rarely center those more fun experiences for users with disabilities. And when we launched Guided Frame, which is a feature designed to empower low vision users to take selfies, the critical reception was incredible because it was the first time that a blind user had felt kind of seen, motivated, and empowered and just encouraged to have fun, because they had been told, well, why would a blind user want to take a selfie? Of course they want to. They were just never given the ability to easily do that.
That's great. And Thea, do you, from your work, do you have a perspective on accessibility within the broader spectrum of inclusion?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a couple of points. So definitely agree with what's been said. And I think maybe adding to that is just thinking around tech, ethics in tech in the sense of how it's designed, both of the software and the hardware, around some of these issues. Because it's, when you think about access and ability, it's very hard to retrofit, which is, we see quite a bit happening now. So again, how is that actually integral at every single part of the tech design? So I think that just as a core level, but different areas that we're also thinking specifically around abilities and disabilities as well. Again, how are we thinking about those core to the design, not necessarily pushed aside as, for example, a CSR, or specifically only thought of as like tech for good, which is important, but again, it needs to be integral. So for example, going back to a gaming example, there's lots of different individuals or consultants that potentially are blind and actually are hired by companies specifically to stress test different gaming, so that again, everyone who wants to use it can use it. And I think even within that, also, making sure that there's stronger representation in some of those platforms of, different individuals with different abilities as well. So those are some of the, I think, bare minimum that I think needs to be in place. I think two other areas is also just, to have access and want to access is also thinking around, do you feel safe online? And also just recognizing so much of what our lives online are now shifting offline. So for example, one of the organizations that we support is called Feminist Frequency, and works really towards like culture shifts in the gaming industry with specific companies, but then also with different gaming communities directly. So especially through a hotline, but then also guidance if people are targeted offline. I think that's increasingly needed, especially for women, people of color, and I would say increasingly, sadly, on a day by day, of different trans communities, as we're seeing a lot of hostility, obviously, across the US. So again, there needs to be different guardrails in place, and it's the responsibility really across the sector that they're in space, but then also recognizing and supporting different organizations that are actually looking to find solutions. So that's one piece. And I think just another piece is also going back to who's actually designing in the first place. So, one of the areas that we're supporting, and thankfully a lot of other foundations are as well, is just recognizing that, who's actually designing, let's say, Web3 or AI. Right now, it's going to be the same people that potentially funded previous versions. So, one of the things that we're trying to do is get much smarter and around supporting historically Black colleges and universities, especially in AI and in different types of technology. Again, looking at the hardware, but on different types of technologies that are going to be used in the future. So to make sure who's actually designing them is really at the core, not just, again, just assuming that somehow everything will be designed for all.
Right. Yeah, the teams that make them are just as important as the people you're making them for. That makes sense. Great. So, I mean, Priscilla, you built this community, maybe not intentionally in the beginning, but now definitely with this, you're serving a group of people who have these lived experiences and needs. In your opinion, what's the best way for people to make sure that they're accomplishing, serving those needs of people's lived experiences?
That's a great question. What comes to mind is really framing everything in mind with the people that are on the other end of the screen. I always, think about, whenever I share a post or I share a podcast episode, it's not just the numbers or it's not the algorithm. It's truly the people that are going to be taking this on their morning walk or making this part of the routine, or checking in and seeing how this can help them or apply to their day to day, and kind of remembering who the people are behind that screen. And one way that I focus on this is through language, and the language that we use on Sadie Baddies is always coming from a place of open-mindedness, of curiosity, rather than definitive this or that, or creating things in a very binary way. And also just being inclusive with the type of language we use, and being mindful of the queer community that's a part of Sadie Baddies, of the disabled community that's part of Sadie Baddies, that the chronically ill people who come and look for ways to find connection and deepen their connections with each other on the Sadi Baddies platform. So language has always been something that's really important and central, and also taking in and unpacking some of that language that's used in typically the mental health space or even clinical spaces. I do have a background in healthcare and in clinical research, so I'm familiar with some of these terms, but how do we break down, for example, chronic depression to someone who doesn't really understand it, or may only understand it as sadness? How do we break it down? How do we include visuals, videos, memes, GIFs? How do we, and ignite this conversation so that it doesn't feel so scary and so overwhelming, so that people don't shy away from, maybe accessing resources or deepening this conversation, but instead they're curious about it. So that's one way we incorporate humor, we incorporate evidence-based information, but always with a place of compassion and softness. And one other way that I've been, trying to make sure that this is a human-centric experience and can speak to people's lived experiences is also through, including things like captions in our videos. Now I never post a video unless it has captions, even if it's on a story, because it's huge. And now I'm looking for captions on other people's videos and making sure that I can follow along, because sometimes, you just want to hit that mute button and you may not be able to have the volume on, or depending on what setting or what your ability is, your hearing ability is. So just being mindful of those features that are already embedded in these tools that we're using every single day, and actually utilizing them and making sure that we're centering the people who are on the other side of that screen.
That's great. So Thea, I'd love to dive into something you kind of touched on a little bit about sort of power imbalances, and part of your role is to make investments in people and organizations and projects that are helping to address the power imbalances, ensuring accountability, strengthening protection safeguards, especially in the emerging technology field, all of which, is helping sort of address, I think, and fuel inclusivity. But to you, what does it mean to you to be able to invest in creating these, more human-centric internet? And do you think it's even possible for us to bridge this gap?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's difficult, because obviously a lot of it requires, I'd say, massive power shifts in so many different ways. And even when it comes to different foundations, who foundations are actually traditionally funding and who they're funding now, and potentially will be funding moving forward. So that definitely can't be, that definitely has to be recognized as well. But I think, some of the ways, especially now, and I think hopefully moving forward as well, is how are we supporting individuals or organizations that are really thinking about different models that are going to be potentially the template for the future. So, for example, one of our partners is Dr. Kishana Gray. She's the author of Intersectional Tech, Black Users in Gaming. She's a professor at the University of Kentucky. And one of the things that she spends a lot of time looking at is just recognizing that microeconomies and microtransactions, for example, in streaming platforms, for some people it may seem, okay, that's one thing, but these are actually going to be the business models of the future. So one of the things that she's also looking at, and we're trying to support her and different academics and practitioners in that space, is making sure that these revenue models are actually designed for everyone to actually make money, specifically not just white men, which seems to be the trend right now. So what does that need to look like? What do templates need to look like for these models by race, age, and gender? So they're looking at microtransactions, but again, these really are the business models, especially on these in-game platforms, but even some of the broader platforms. So so really trying to support different I'd say leaders in this space that are really thinking about what it could look like and what it should look like. So again, rather than coming back and having to retrofit, how are we mitigating some of these issues to begin with? And I would say also part of that, and it's very much linked across some of the other focus areas beyond responsible technology, is we work a lot with platform workers and gig workers. And what we see in that space as well, it kind of goes back to who owns data. So there's the issues around the algorithmic bias, but it's also recognizing is when it comes to Uber and these different companies, the value is the data, right? There's not really many assets for these companies. So it's really around the data. So how are we also working with some of these organizations, and it comes from obviously from regulatory environment and individuals and even unions, how are we making sure that those drivers themselves are actually have ownership of their data, or at least they know the value of that data. So again, these are the issues of today that we know are only going to be increasing in the future. And then just one more area is that we're looking at quite a bit, and it goes to the economy piece. It's just recognizing that, you know, all of our online presence more and more is being bought and sold by different data brokers. So we've gotten very engaged, especially in the past year, of supporting especially different grassroots organizations that are really that are able to share how this is actually impacting them. So for example, what we see a lot of times is personal data that's used online, whether that's, you know, paying bills or potentially credit scores is being bought and sold. And that's it's often sold potentially to police departments, it's being sold to Homeland Security and all these different areas. And so that has a longer term impact, which again, a little bit goes back to the access, is that you don't necessarily want to be online, which even though you need to be, because you're not really sure necessarily where your data is going into. So again, so we're kind of looking at some of these issues through very different lens when we think about like human centric. So it's around access, but also around what is the long-term implications of your online presence.
That's great. So Angelo, when you know, you were talking earlier about the different ways that you're sort of approaching making sure that inclusion is at the core of how you're approaching your digital products. You know, what's your advice? Like, how do we decenter ourselves and our own lived experiences, which are not necessarily everybody's, when we're creating these digital experiences to help move toward a more universal approach? What's your advice?
Yeah, this has come up in a few different answers, and Thea was talking about it a little bit as well, and I see questions coming from the community. I think having a end-to-end process to actually do checks and balances, make the right decisions across critical inflection points is the best way to implement this. I think when you do things at scale, build a process, it forces you to be intentional and diligent and intelligent as well about rather than be kind of like off the cuff about how your decision making is going to be made. So at Google, we have a process. I can share what that is if it's helpful, but develop your own and stick to it and kind of help it scale. So the way that we're doing end-to-end product development testing that kind of centers most at-risk users is around 4 kind of key inflection moments in product development. So the first is ideation and user research. So bringing in diverse perspectives to ensure you're building not just for yourself or those that like you. And this is especially relevant when the teams building those products do not represent a broad swath of people. This was brought up as well. Can be very dangerous if you don't have a diverse team in the first place. So that's why ideation, bringing in others and testing, as well as the user research that you're doing, like don't do it in a bubble. Get yourself out of Silicon Valley or New York City or wherever you are and really go sit with the users, your users in a variety of areas and learn what their needs or gaps are and implement those solutions rather than the solutions you think you know about your user. And then the next step is around designing specifications and prototyping. So when you have technical specifications, it allows your engineering teams to break them down and attempt to technically implement them. But if they're not written correctly or written with a diverse or inclusive lens, then the solution does not get developed for a diverse and inclusive audience. And that tends to be where product development breaks, because the engineering talent is not the same as those that really understand the users and the user needs. So if we don't translate that well, the failure happens right at that juncture. And then you can also prototype to make sure that you are achieving that vision before you go to full scale. And then once you've developed that service or solution, this is where building and testing with users comes into play. You don't always get it right. And this is where I encourage, like, you put your solutions in front of your users from a myriad of backgrounds and ask them to break it. So breaking it or adversarial testing is essentially like ask these dog fooders or as we call them internally at Google, to find the gaps that the team did not realize in terms of where the solution does not work for a subset of folks. And then the fourth step is around marketing and strategic narrative. This one I think tends to be the most obvious, or where the industry tends to focus, is how you sell the message or include representative faces or voices. I think that we need to work truly backwards from that. Like, having inclusive marketing is not the same as having an inclusive product. But when you're doing your inclusive marketing, my advice there is, like, make sure it's not stereotypical or just sheer kind of lip service. You have a person of color in your commercial, but the product for some reason doesn't work for people of color is a total miss. And this is very commonplace in the industry. So a holistic process from start to finish is what I would recommend. Map it to whatever your critical moments are. And we're really proud at Google. The way that we've launched this process best, I think, was with our Google Pixel camera, which has received kind of numerous mentions and awards for being one of the most inclusive cameras in the space, because it was designed even at the hardware and sensor level to work for people of all different skin tones, people backgrounds, and to establish equitable outcomes in the feature set.
That's great. So Priscilla, you were talking a little bit about language being really important for how you're fostering that community. Do you have any tips for how you're able to, because you've been building this community for a few years now, how do you build this community with longevity? How do you continue to meet their needs? Because, the world is evolving, as are, I'm sure, the needs of your community. So how do you continue to make sure that you're meeting those needs?
I would say definitely tapping into what the younger generation needs, what they're talking about. I'm fortunate enough to have hired my younger sister, who goes to Howard University. Her name is Angel, and she's our community manager. And she's amazing because not only is she a college student, she's a generation removed from me, and she really understands what is important, what do people want to talk about. And she has a certain perspective that, even though I'm 10 years removed from her, I appreciate that insight and that perspective that she shares. And she is able to help inform, some of the topics that we share, or the way that things are broken down. Or she might say, I think this is great, but let's add a little bit more humor into this, or let's focus on this conversation, because this is what me and all my friends are talking about on campus right now. So Gen Z, to me, they are a lighthouse in a way of what we can look forward to in terms of building a sustainable community online and offline. I think that the younger generation is always going to be 10 steps ahead. I mean, the access of information that she has, my younger sister, or anyone that's in that generation, is tenfold what I had when I was that age. So looking to see what are the key, talking points, and how you can incorporate that into what you're already doing. You don't necessarily need to change your entire product or change what you're already working towards, but having younger people and having folks who can be a part of that conversation is going to allow you to look 10 years into the future and see, okay, this is what's going to stick and this is what's not going to stick. For example, one thing that we've had to kind of fighting nail and foot at the beginning, but I've been way more open and embraced it, is including more video content. I was definitely more of a long form. I love writing on the blog and updating that's kind of my bread and butter. I love the writing portion of creativity, but I had no choice but to adapt and include more video content. So being adaptable and understanding that you can still have, your message or what your core focus is, but including some of those elements that will help you to be more visible to other folks who might be outside of your target audience. To me, that is one of the best ways to stay not only relevant, but stay ahead of the curve in the future. And yeah, hire more young folks. They're brilliant. They know so much. They're so knowledgeable. And I'm learning a lot every day just by tuning in and tapping into what is actually relevant, and how we can upgrade and adapt as we continue to grow this community.
That's great. Thank you, Priscilla. I think that sort of taps into some of what I think other folks were saying about, you know, bringing in the right people to be a part of these teams. And so, bringing in a younger generation can help you make sure that you're serving that part of your audience. So that's great. So I think we're at time here where we should take some questions. I know we have some from the community and would love to be able to at least try to cover some of them before we call it. So let's see. The first one. It is it important for people building products and communities to audit their current best practices around inclusion and accessibility, and how would one do that? Angela or Thea, do you have any thoughts on this one that you'd like to respond?
I can start. I think it's absolutely essential, first of all. So some of the auditing that can be done, I think, follows the kind of process, the step process that I spoke about earlier. So at each stage of development, making sure that the product is working for all users, especially the most at-risk users. I like to call those variables like input variables, though, because it doesn't mean that the product's going to be successful. It's more, did you meet the requirements that we all agreed to? Did you test this data with a diverse set of users? Did you build the AI model responsibly and ethically? So we have process steps. You can build, you can even be in a Trix that monitors it and scores it subjectively. Best way to do it is to build an actual process that automates and has a really kind of thoughtful process for scoring these kind of inputs. What I think is much more valuable is output metrics. So an actual measurement of how is your product received by various different communities? What is the representation of the diversity of populations that are using your products and their user satisfaction related to them? That is really hard to do. And I don't think the industry at large has cracked that nut around kind of inclusive data collection, inclusive modeling, leveraging data analytics within accessibility and inclusion to make product decisions. So that's something that I'm working on. I know a lot of industry leaders are working on. Would love to brainstorm solutions, but having a process to audit at least the inputs and make sure you're making the right decisions is essential. And then looking at output metrics so that we could just be smart business decision makers is where we'd like to be long term.
That's great. Thea, anything to add to that from your experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, totally agree. I mean, I think what's exciting is that, you think in the AI space, there's lots of new actual practical tools coming out, especially around AI space. So I think, as a funder, what we're trying to do, is fund different models. And again, not just funding them, but how are we actually supporting different organizations that are getting these out, to the general public. So I think one thing which may seem a little bit different is when you think about these different models, one of the areas we're really supporting more and more is around journalism and investigative journalists as well, so that they actually understand some of this technology, so that they also, when they're writing, when they're asking questions, they're asking the right questions around this as well, so that it's not just necessarily engineers, or it's not necessarily only academics that really understand what's happening behind the scenes.
So we have another question. This is for Priscilla, actually. So I'm sure you've investigated a ton of different platforms. Why did you end up leveraging Geneva? And what were some of the features that really stood out for you?
Yes, I love Geneva. I've been a user of Geneva for the last couple years, and Geneva is, for those who don't know, has been quoted by the Washington Post, I believe, as Discord for hot people. So, I mean, I think that kind of sums up what it's about. But it's great. It's very user friendly. It's accessible, but we've created a private home in Geneva, and Sadi Baddies has over 1,800 members in our Geneva home alone. So These are, community members where we can have in-depth conversations that we may not be comfortable having necessarily maybe on Instagram or Twitter or other platforms. Geneva is really the home where we can have more in-depth conversations and also share more information. So there's different chat rooms. There's an audio only room that we use where we can have kind of just like almost like a voice note session with your friends. And instead of showing video, it's just audio only. So kind of like a mini podcast with folks. And it's become it's become a major tool for people from all over the country and also all over the world to connect on Geneva. And because of that, we've actually created several homes within our Geneva space to have, folks who are from living in London, or folks who are living in Brazil, or folks who are living all over the world, and they're able to network within these micro homes that we've created within our Sadie Baddies home. And I think the feature that I love the most about Geneva is that you can literally just show up as you are. There is no like timeline or feed really. It's really just removing that screen that I would say you can kind of feel when you're on other platforms, and it decentralizes the community. So it instead of it being one person like myself, the founder, facilitating these conversations, people are facilitating conversations amongst themselves. So it kind of removes the onus of having to delegate and start a conversation and moderate, and it allows people to have more intimate connections and opportunities to not only show up and be vulnerable, but to discover other homes and discover resources that may not be able to be shared as widely on other platforms. So yeah, definitely love Geneva, and happy to have partnered with them a few times.
That's great. The home of hot people. So I think we have time for one last question. It is, what has COVID taught us about the tech gap when learning went online? So I think that's speaking to some of the historics around access to internet, I think. But I would, does anyone on the panel here have some thoughts on this question about anything that you learned through this experience of learning online?
I can start. I can't answer it from a perspective of when learning went online, because I don't work in kind of the EDU space, but just the move from more kind of physical to digital across the world because of COVID. So retail booming online, whether it be at Amazon or through Google searches and advertising through Google. There's a few things. I think it really pronounced the digital divide. I wouldn't call them new learnings though, because I feel like we've known about this. It just pronounced them further, and it caused a bigger push to address them. So one is the digital divide. So that's the access to internet infrastructure, digital information, online tools between different geographies throughout the world, and needing to address that, because a solution developed for the United States does not work the same way as a solution developed for the emerging market, where there might be bandwidth constraints. So needing to build our products more inclusively to follow the trend for coming online across the world. So that was one big learning. And I think the other one is just around like really unpacking the diversity of our users across the world. So you think about what we saw very quickly is we weren't necessarily serving the right types of data back. So when you were used to building in a US centric way, when someone searches bride gowns, you see like a beautiful traditional wedding dress and perhaps a white woman wearing that wedding dress. That's not the answer that billions of people are looking for. They might be looking for a sari or an Indian garb, other traditional garbs from Africa. So really understanding that the world is fueled by people with different needs, and making sure that our products are inclusively addressing their solutions. And then it lend into like kind of, we call it the return on influence, the new ROI, which is the idea that these we call them emerging markets, but they tend to be the actual trendsetters for the zeitgeist of our generation. This is Gen Z, this is African American culture, LGBTQ culture. So they're not the minority in a way. They're actually the ones that are leading the way on new trends and new revenue opportunities. So we've quickly repositioned like our mental models to say, oh, US Latinos have $2 trillion in buying power, right? Like, why would we consider that a minority group rather than directly serve those users? And COVID has been absolutely terrible and awful in a lot of ways, but also unpacked a lot of great learnings for how to be more inclusive. So that was some of the good from that.
That's great. Priscilla, anything from your perspective about, any new or just, double down on knowledge that you already had from that, when we went online during the beginning of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I could add, I think just building on some of the points that Priscilla had made, it's just, when you talk about Gen Z, we have a new area of funding that specifically just focuses on digital natives, which essentially is Gen Z. Just, I think part of it too was the recognition, I think maybe globally to some extent, about ultimately the power that Gen Z have, because so many have been only grown up online. And I think just recognizing that, so one, it's making sure that it's not performative. You don't, for example, like have a youth, for example, or a 20-year-old on a panel or these different types of things. It actually needs to be integrated. So for example, how are, not only tech, but policies, all these different designed actually by Gen Z is so critical. So, for funder perspectives, like why aren't we supporting actually not organizations that work with or support, but actually Gen Z led organizations? And I think that oddly, because of COVID, I think that just became clearer and more apparent quite a bit during COVID. Yeah, I think actually, but on the flip side as well, and we've seen some successes recently in California and even in the UK. It's just, I think, online safety. I think, for youth, but I think children just became such. It's always been obviously an extremely important issue, but I think it just received much more a global notice. So I think too that again, oddly, I think moved forward, again, potentially different regulations or policies that maybe wouldn't have moved as quickly if everybody wasn't online for 2 years.
That's great. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. But I want a big thank you to our panelists today, to Priscilla, Thea, and Angelo. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your experience and your perspective. We're also very thankful to have our continued support from Omidyar Network on this partnership so we can do things like this. So to all of you folks who are watching, I hope that you can take this inspiration into your work and your life and move some of this into action. Because as the title of this event implies, it's up to us. So thanks for joining us today. We'll see you all on the internet. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.